The mountain man found her collapsed beside the creek, her dress torn and stained with dust, one hand clutching her swollen belly as though she could protect what remained of her shattered world. Caleb Hawthorne had been tracking elk through the high country above Ash Fork, Arizona, when he heard the sound of retching echoing off the canyon walls. It was late September 1877, and the aspens were turning gold against the impossibly blue sky. He approached cautiously, his rifle lowered but ready, expecting perhaps a wounded animal or a sick traveler. What he found instead was a young woman on her hands and knees beside the water, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and despair. She looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, and even in her desperate state, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in tangles around her pale face. Dirt streaked her cheeks where tears had carved clean paths through the grime. She could not have been more than 20 years old, and she was clearly several months along with child. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please do not send me back." Caleb set his rifle against a pine tree and crouched down a respectful distance from her. He was a big man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a deer carcass down from the high peaks without breaking stride. His muscles had been earned through years of survival in the mountains, of splitting wood and hauling water and wrestling with nature itself. His dark blonde hair hung past his collar, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his solitary life. He had kind eyes, a warm brown that softened his otherwise rugged features. "I am not sending you anywhere," he said gently. "But you look like you need help. Are you hurt?" The woman shook her head, but fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I have nowhere to go. My father, he threw me out, said I brought shame to his name. I've been walking for 2 days, maybe 3. I cannot remember anymore." Caleb felt anger kindle in his gut, but he kept his voice calm. "What is your name?" "Theresa Greene." "Miss Greene, I am Caleb Hawthorne. I have a cabin about 3 miles from here. It is not much, but it is warm and dry, and I have food. Will you let me help you?" She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Finally, she nodded. "I do not have any other choice." "Everyone has choices," Caleb said. "You are choosing to accept help from a stranger, which takes courage." He helped her to her feet, noting how light she felt despite her condition. When had she last eaten a proper meal? Her dress, though fine quality, was filthy and torn at the hem. She wore no coat, though the mountain air had a sharp bite to it. Caleb shrugged out of his heavy wool jacket and draped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame completely. "Can you walk, or should I carry you?" "I can walk," Theresa said, though her legs shook with the effort of standing. They made slow progress through the forest. Caleb matched his stride to hers, staying close in case she stumbled. He could see the effort it cost her to keep moving, the way she pressed one hand to her lower back and breathed through obvious discomfort. Twice he offered to carry her, and twice she refused with quiet determination. "You are stubborn," he observed without judgment. "I have been told that before," she replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The cabin was solid and well built, constructed of pine logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke curled from the stone chimney. It was a single large room with a sleeping loft above, simple but clean. Caleb settled Theresa into the rocking chair near the fireplace and built up the fire. Then he poured water from a bucket into a kettle and set it to heat. From his stores, he pulled out dried venison, beans, and a precious tin of peaches he'd been saving for a special occasion. This seemed special enough. "When did you last eat?" he asked as he worked. "Yesterday morning. I found some berries." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He prepared a simple meal of beans and venison, heating the peaches separately as a treat. While the food cooked, he poured warm water into a basin and brought it to her with a clean cloth. "You might want to wash up," he said. "I will step outside and tend to the horses." When he returned 20 minutes later, Theresa had cleaned her face and hands and attempted to pin up her hair. She looked slightly less like a woman who had been walking through the wilderness for days, though exhaustion still shadowed her eyes. Caleb served the food on tin plates, and they ate in silence for several minutes. Finally, Theresa spoke. You must think I am a terrible person." Caleb looked up from his plate. "Why would I think that?" "Because I am with child and I have no husband. Because my own father thought me so shameful he could not bear to look at me." "I think your father is a fool," Caleb said bluntly. "And I think you are a brave young woman in a difficult situation. What happened to the child's father?" Theresa's expression hardened. "He was the son of a wealthy rancher outside Ash Fork. We were courting, or so I thought. When I told him about the baby, he said I was lying, trying to trap him into marriage. His father paid mine a visit, threatened to ruin our family's store if I did not recant my claims. My father gave me a choice, say I had lied and made the whole thing up, or leave his house forever." She met Caleb's eyes. "I could not lie. Not about this, not about my child." "Good," Caleb said firmly. "Truth matters, even when it costs us." They finished their meal. And Caleb insisted that Theresa take his bed in the loft. He would sleep on the floor near the fire. She was too tired to argue. As she climbed the ladder, moving carefully with her belly, Caleb banked the fire and laid out his bedroll. He stared up at the ceiling for a long time, listening to the small sounds of her settling in above him. He had been alone in these mountains for 3 years, ever since the fever had taken his parents and younger sister. He had come here to escape his grief, to lose himself in the demanding work of survival. He had not expected to ever bring another person into his carefully constructed solitude, let alone a pregnant young woman fleeing her family's judgment. Yet, something about Theresa Greene called to him. Maybe it was the courage he saw in her storm-gray eyes, or the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. Maybe it was simply that he recognized in her the same bone-deep loneliness he carried in himself. Over the next few days, they fell into a careful routine. Caleb would rise before dawn to tend to his chores, hunting and checking his trap lines, chopping wood and hauling water. Theresa would wake later and insisted on helping despite his protests. She swept the cabin floor, mended his shirts with neat, precise stitches, and prepared their meals from his simple stores. She moved slowly, her pregnancy making every task more difficult, but she refused to be idle. "I will not be a burden," she said when he tried to make her rest. "You have been kind enough to take me in. The least I can do is help." "You are not a burden," Caleb replied. "You are a guest and one who has been through an ordeal. There is no shame in resting." But Theresa shook her head stubbornly. "There is shame in being useless." In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Theresa told him about growing up in Ash Fork, about her mother who had died when she was 12, leaving her to help her father run the general store. She spoke of books she had read, of her dream to someday see the ocean. Caleb talked about his childhood in Colorado, about learning to hunt and trap from his father, about the sister who had been only 16 when the fever took her. "I'm sorry," Theresa said softly. "That must have been terrible." "It was," Caleb admitted. "I felt like I had failed them somehow, even though I know there was nothing I could have done. The doctor said the fever just had to run its course." "Grief is not logical," Theresa observed. "It does not care whether we could have changed things or not." Their eyes met across the firelight, and Caleb felt that strange pull again, that sense of recognition. Here was someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have your world upended by forces beyond your control. 1 week became 2, then 3. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of frost in the mornings. Caleb knew he needed to make a trip down to Ash Fork for supplies before winter set in fully, but he hesitated. How could he leave Theresa alone in the cabin in her condition? And how could he take her with him, knowing her father might see her, knowing the townspeople would judge her? The decision was made for him when Theresa's supplies ran out. She needed proper clothing, fabric for the baby, medical supplies in case of complications during the birth. He could not ask her to face the coming winter and motherhood unprepared. "I will go to Prescott instead," Caleb said. "It is farther, but no one there knows either of us." "That is 2 days' travel each way," Theresa protested. 4 days at least. You cannot leave me here that long." "Why not? You are capable and strong. You can manage the cabin for a few days." Theresa bit her lip. "What if something happens? What if the baby comes early?" "You are only about 6 months along, by my estimation. The baby should not come for at least 2 more months." But Caleb frowned, considering. "Still, you are right. It is not ideal. Would you prefer to come with me?" To Prescott? Teresa's eyes widened. I have never been that far from Ash Fork. Then perhaps it is time for an adventure, Caleb said with a small smile. They left 2 days later, Caleb riding his sturdy bay gelding while Theresa sat on his gentler mare. The journey would take them through some rough country, but the weather was holding clear and cool. Caleb had packed supplies carefully, including extra blankets and food in case they needed to camp an extra night. As they rode, Theresa asked him questions about the land they passed through, about the plants and animals, about surviving in the wilderness. Caleb found himself enjoying her curiosity, the way she truly listened to his answers. Most people in town had always seen him as odd, too much of a loner, too comfortable with silence and solitude. But Theresa seemed to appreciate those very qualities. On the first night, they made camp in a sheltered valley where a spring bubbled up between moss-covered rocks. Caleb built a fire and prepared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread he had packed from the cabin. They ate watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. I used to think my life would be so different, Theresa said quietly. I thought I would marry respectably, have children in a proper home, make my father proud. She touched her belly gently. I never imagined this. Life rarely goes as we plan, Caleb said, but that does not mean what you have now is any less valuable. Your child will be loved and wanted. That matters more than respectability. Do you truly believe that? I do. I've seen plenty of respectable people who were cold and cruel. And I have known folks who lived on society's edges who had more honor and kindness in them than a dozen church deacons. Theresa smiled. You are a good man, Caleb Hawthorne. I am just a man, he replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious, trying to do right as I see it. That night, Caleb gave Theresa his bedroll while he kept watch by the fire. He told himself it was just caution, making sure no predators came near their camp. But in truth, he found himself watching her sleep, studying the curve of her cheek in the firelight, the way her hand rested protectively over her belly even in slumber. He was falling for her. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Somewhere between finding her by the creek and these quiet evenings by the fire, between her stubborn insistence on helping and her soft questions about his life, he had started to care for her as more than just someone who needed his help. But what right did he have to those feelings? She was carrying another man's child, a man who had rejected her. She had come to him desperate and alone, seeking shelter, not romance. The last thing she needed was him complicating matters with his own emotions. Caleb stared into the flames and told himself firmly to keep his distance, to remain a friend and protector, and nothing more. They reached Prescott the next afternoon. It was a bustling territorial capital, larger than Ash Fork, with wide streets and substantial buildings. Theresa stared around with wide eyes as they rode down the main thoroughfare, past saloons and hotels, a courthouse, various shops and businesses. Caleb tied the horses outside a general store and helped Theresa dismount. Inside, the proprietor's wife, a kindly woman named Mrs. Patterson, took one look at Theresa's condition and immediately began pulling bolts of soft cotton from the shelves. "You will need fabric for diapers and gowns," she said briskly, "and some flannel for warmth. When are you due, dear?" "Late December or early January," Theresa said quietly. "Then we had best get you properly outfitted. Winter babies need extra care." Mrs. Patterson glanced at Caleb. "Your husband has the right idea, bringing you here. Too many men leave these preparations to the last minute." Theresa opened her mouth, likely to correct the assumption, but Caleb caught her eye and gave a small shake of his head. Let people think what they would. It would make things simpler. They spent 2 hours in the store, gathering supplies. Caleb purchased fabric, thread, needles, yarn for knitting. He bought jars of honey and tins of condensed milk, dried fruits and vegetables, coffee and sugar. He added a book of folk tales and a small wooden puzzle box, thinking of long winter evenings in the cabin. Theresa protested at the cost, but Caleb waved her concerns aside. He had money saved from selling furs and working various jobs before retreating to the mountains. He had little use for it in his solitary life, and now he had a reason to spend it. At a different shop, Caleb bought fabric for 2 new dresses for Theresa, ones that would accommodate her growing belly. The seamstress promised to have them ready by the next afternoon. They took a room at a modest hotel for the night. Caleb was careful to request 2 rooms, but the proprietor looked at Theresa's belly and at Caleb, and with a knowing wink said he only had 1 room available, though it had 2 beds. "That will be fine," Caleb said stiffly. The room was clean and comfortable, with lace curtains at the window and a washstand with a porcelain pitcher and basin. Theresa sank onto one of the beds with a sigh of relief. "I did not realize how tired I was until just now," she admitted. "Riding all day is more exhausting than I expected." "Rest," Caleb said. "I will go get us some dinner and bring it back." He returned half an hour later with 2 plates of roast chicken, potatoes, and greens from the hotel's dining room. They ate sitting on their respective beds, the awkwardness of the situation hovering between them. "Thank you," Theresa said finally, "for everything. The supplies, this room, all of it. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "I do not want repayment," Caleb said. "I am helping because I want to, because it is the right thing to do." "But you have spent so much money. Money is just paper and metal. It is worth less than kindness." Caleb set his empty plate aside. "Theresa, I need you to understand something. You are not a burden to me. You are not a debt that needs to be repaid. You are a person who deserves help and respect, and I am glad to give both." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm not used to being spoken to like that. My father, near the end, he made me feel like I was worthless, like I had ruined everything he worked for." "Your father was wrong." Caleb spoke with quiet intensity. "What happened to you could have happened to any young woman. The man who did this, who made you promises and then abandoned you, he is the one who should be ashamed, not you." Theresa wiped at her eyes. "How can you be so certain?" "Because I have eyes to see who you are. You are brave and strong and determined. You chose truth over comfort. Those are not the qualities of a worthless person." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling between them. Finally, Theresa rose and crossed to where Caleb sat. She took his large, calloused hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for not judging me." Caleb looked down at their joined hands and felt his carefully constructed resolve beginning to crumble. He wanted to pull her closer, to promise her that everything would be all right, that he would take care of her and her child for as long as she needed. But he forced himself to simply squeeze her hands gently and then release them. "Get some rest," he said. "We have another long ride ahead of us tomorrow." They picked up the finished dresses the next afternoon and began the journey back to the cabin. The weather had turned while they were in Prescott, clouds building over the mountains, the air taking on that electric quality that promised rain or perhaps early snow. Caleb pushed them to make good time, wanting to reach the cabin before any storm broke. They rode until well after dark, finally arriving cold and exhausted. Caleb quickly tended to the horses while Theresa stumbled inside to restart the fire. By the time he came in, she had the cabin warming and had put water on to heat for coffee. Her new dress, a practical dark blue calico, looked much better than her old torn garment. She had pinned her hair up neatly, and despite the exhaustion on her face, she looked stronger than she had when he first found her. Over the next few weeks, they settled back into their routine. But something had shifted between them during the journey to Prescott. They found themselves sitting closer by the fire in the evenings. Their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Theresa asked Caleb about his dreams, what he wanted from life. Caleb found himself admitting things he had never told anyone. "I came to the mountains to hide," he said one night. "After my family died, I could not stand to be around people anymore. Everyone either pitied me or avoided me, and I hated both. Up here, I did not have to face any of that." "Are you still hiding?" Theresa asked softly. Caleb considered. "No," he said finally. "Not anymore. You changed that." "How?" "You reminded me what it feels like to care about someone, to wake up thinking about making someone else happy instead of just surviving another day." Theresa's breath caught. "Caleb, I do not want you to feel obligated to me because of my circumstances." "This is not about obligation." Caleb turned to face her fully. "Theresa, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I expect nothing in return. I just want you to know the truth." She nodded, her gray eyes wide. "I am falling in love with you," Caleb said simply. "Maybe I have been since I found you by that creek. I know your life is complicated right now. I know you are carrying another man's child, and I know you may not feel the same way about me. But I needed you to know how I feel. You deserve honesty." Tears spilled down Theresa's cheeks. "Oh, Caleb, I've been so afraid to even think about such things. I am damaged goods, that is what my father said. What man would want me now?" "You are not damaged," Caleb said fiercely. "You are beautiful and strong, and any man would be lucky to earn your affection." He reached out and gently wiped away her tears with his thumb. "I am not asking you to make any decisions right now. I just wanted you to know that whatever you need, whatever you choose, I am here. I will help you raise your child if you will let me. I will build you a bigger cabin, provide for you both. Or if you want to leave when the spring comes, I will help you get wherever you want to go." "You would do all that?" Theresa whispered. "Even if I could give you nothing in return?" "You have already given me more than you know. You have given me a reason to live again instead of just existing." Theresa leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. Caleb wrapped his arms carefully around her, mindful of her belly between them. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding each other while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. Finally, Theresa pulled back enough to look up at him. "I am falling in love with you too," she admitted. "I have been trying not to, telling myself it was too soon, too complicated. But every morning when I wake up, you are my first thought. Every evening, I find myself watching you, memorizing the way you move, the sound of your voice. I feel safe with you, Caleb. Safe in a way I have never felt before." Caleb cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," she breathed. He kissed her softly, gently, as though she were something precious that might break. Theresa sighed against his mouth and kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his broad chest. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "I want to marry you," Caleb said. "Not because I think I have to, not to give the baby a name, but because I want to spend my life with you. I want to be your husband, and I want to be a father to your child." "Are you certain?" Theresa searched his face. "Once we are married, there is no going back. You will be tied to me and my mistakes." "You are not a mistake. This child is not a mistake. And yes, I am certain. I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Fresh tears streamed down Theresa's face, but these were tears of joy. "Then yes, yes, I will marry you." They kissed again, deeper this time, with the promise of a future stretching before them. When they finally separated, Caleb started making plans out loud. "We should go to Flagstaff," he said. "It is about 60 miles north of here. We can find a preacher there, get properly married. I do not want there to be any question about the legality of it." "When?" Theresa asked. Caleb calculated in his head. It was late October now. Theresa was perhaps 7 months pregnant, which meant the baby would come in late December or early January. "We should go soon," he said, "before the heavy snows and while you are still comfortable traveling. We could leave in a week, give us time to prepare." "A week?" Theresa repeated, a smile spreading across her face. "In a week, I will be Mrs. Hawthorne." "If you want to keep your own name, that is acceptable too," Caleb said quickly. "I will not force you to give up your identity." Theresa shook her head. "I want your name. I want to be part of your family, to build something new together." They spent the next week in a flurry of preparation. Caleb hunted and smoked meat, chopped enough wood to last through any early storms, made sure the cabin was secure against weather and predators. Theresa used some of the fabric they had purchased to make herself a new dress, this one in a soft cream color that she said would be suitable for a wedding. On the night before they were to leave, Theresa grew quiet and pensive. Caleb found her standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit forest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "My father," she admitted. "I know he cast me out. I know he said terrible things to me. But part of me still wishes he could be there when I marry. Is that foolish?" "No," Caleb said gently. "He is still your father. It is natural to want his blessing, even if he does not deserve to give it. I keep thinking about how he will never know his grandchild, how I will never be able to introduce our baby to its grandfather." She looked up at Caleb. "Is it wrong that I still love him, even though he hurt me so badly?" "Love is never wrong. It is what you do with that love that matters." Caleb wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Your father made his choice when he threw you out. That does not mean you have to stop loving him, but it does mean you cannot let his rejection define you. I wish things could be different. I know. But sometimes we have to build new families from the people who choose to love us, not the ones we happen to be born to. They left for Flagstaff at first light. The journey would take 3 days, possibly 4 given Theresa's condition. Caleb kept their pace easy, stopping frequently to let Theresa rest. Her belly had grown noticeably larger in recent weeks, and she tired more easily now. On the second night, they made camp near a small lake that reflected the stars like a mirror. After dinner, Theresa asked Caleb to tell her about his family, really tell her, not just the facts of their deaths, but who they had been when they were alive. Caleb found himself talking about his mother's laugh, how it had filled their small house with joy. He described his father's patient teaching, the way he had shown Caleb how to read animal tracks, how to move silently through the forest. He spoke of his sister Lily, who had been spirited and funny, always getting into mischief, but somehow charming her way out of trouble. "Oh, they sound wonderful," Theresa said softly. "I wish I could have met them." "They would have loved you," Caleb said with certainty. "My mother especially. She always said the measure of a person was not what they had, but how they treated others when they had nothing to gain from kindness." "Is that why you helped me?" Theresa asked. "Because your mother taught you to be kind? I helped you because you needed help, and because something in your eyes reminded me that I was still human, still capable of caring about someone other than myself." They reached Flagstaff on the 4th day, arriving in the afternoon. The town was larger than Prescott, sitting at a higher elevation where the air was thin and crisp. Snow already dusted the peaks of the San Francisco mountains to the north. Caleb found them a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who clucked her tongue at Theresa's condition, but asked no prying questions. While Theresa rested, Caleb went in search of a minister. He found one at a small church on the edge of town. Reverend Morrison was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a thoughtful manner. When Caleb explained that he wanted to marry Theresa, the Reverend studied him carefully. "The young lady is expecting, I assume?" "Yes," Caleb said, seeing no point in lying. "And the child is yours?" "The child will be mine," Caleb said firmly. "I will raise it as my own, love it as my own. The circumstances of its birth are irrelevant." Reverend Morrison nodded slowly. "That's a good answer. Better than most I hear in these situations. Very well, I will perform the ceremony. When would you like to marry?" "As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if you can arrange it." "Tomorrow it is, then. Come to the church at 2 o'clock. That evening, back at the boarding house, Caleb gave Theresa the news. She looked both excited and terrified. "Tomorrow," she whispered. "We will be married tomorrow." "Unless you have changed your mind," Caleb said. "You can still choose differently, Theresa. I will not hold it against you." She shook her head firmly. "I have not changed my mind. I'm just nervous. What if I am not a good wife? What if I disappoint you?" "Impossible," Caleb said. "You could never disappoint me." The next morning, Theresa put on her cream-colored dress and pinned up her hair with extra care. Caleb had gotten his hair trimmed and his beard neatly shaped at the barber. He wore his best shirt, a dark gray that brought out his brown eyes, and a clean pair of trousers. At 1:45, they walked together toward the church. The October afternoon was cold and clear, with that particular quality of light that made everything seem sharper, more vivid. As they approached the church steps, Theresa suddenly stopped. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked. "I just realized," she said quietly. "I will be walking down the aisle alone. My father should be here to give me away, but he is not. He chose not to be." Caleb saw the pain in her eyes and felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. He stepped in front of her and took both her hands in his. "Then I will walk you down," he said. "I will walk you down the aisle, and when the Reverend asks who gives you in marriage, I will say that you give yourself, free and proud, and choosing your own path." "But that is not traditional," Theresa protested weakly. "Neither is anything else about us," Caleb pointed out. "We make our own traditions." But even as he said it, Caleb could see it was not enough. Theresa wanted this moment to be special, wanted the traditional elements even if her situation was anything but traditional. He thought quickly. "Wait here," he said, "just for a moment." He hurried into the church and found Reverend Morrison preparing the altar. Quickly, Caleb explained his idea. The Reverend listened and then smiled. "That is highly unusual," he said. "But then again, love itself is unusual. Yes, I think we can manage that." Caleb returned to Theresa, who looked confused. "What are you doing?" "You will see. Trust me?" "Always." They entered the church together, but instead of proceeding down the aisle, Caleb positioned Theresa at the back. Then, to her surprise, he walked down the aisle himself, taking his place at the altar beside Reverend Morrison. The Reverend raised his voice so it carried to where Theresa stood. "Who comes to stand with this bride on her wedding day? Who comes to give her the honor and support she deserves?" Caleb walked back down the aisle with slow, measured steps. He was a mountain man, rough around the edges, more comfortable with solitude than ceremony. But in that moment, he carried himself with a dignity and pride that filled the small church. He stopped before Theresa and offered her his arm. "I do," he said clearly. "I come to walk beside her, not as her owner to give her away, but as her partner to honor her choice." Tears streamed down Theresa's face as she took his arm. Together, they walked down the aisle. When they reached the altar, Caleb helped Theresa turn to face him, and then he took his place beside her. Reverend Morrison looked between them with approval. "Dearly beloved," he began. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Caleb had purchased a simple gold band in Flagstaff that morning, which he slipped onto Theresa's finger when the time came. They spoke their vows clearly, Caleb's deep voice and Theresa's softer one blending together in the quiet church. "I, Caleb, take you, Theresa, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, to protect you, to stand beside you in all things. I promise to be a father to your child, to love them as my own. I promise to build a life with you, whatever storms may come. I, Theresa, take you, Caleb, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to honor you, to trust you, to be your partner in all things. I promise to build a home with you, to face whatever the future holds together. I promise to love you with everything I am." "By the power vested in me," Reverend Morrison said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Caleb cupped Theresa's face in his hands and kissed her gently, reverently, as though sealing a sacred promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling through tears. They signed the marriage certificate, Reverend Morrison and Mrs. Chen, who had been fetched to serve as witness, adding their signatures. It was official and legal, recorded in the church books. Theresa was now Mrs. Theresa Hawthorne. That evening, they celebrated with a quiet dinner at the boarding house. Mrs. Chen had prepared a special meal of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie. She fussed over Theresa, making sure she ate enough, and congratulated Caleb on his marriage. "You seem like good people," she said. "I hope you will be very happy together." "Thank you," Theresa said warmly. "We intend to be." They left Flagstaff the next morning and began the journey back to the cabin. Now that they were married, Caleb felt free to be more openly affectionate. He helped Theresa mount her horse with gentle hands, checked on her frequently during the ride, pulled her close when they made camp at night. "I cannot believe we are married," Theresa said on their second night on the trail. "Sometimes I think I will wake up and discover this was all a dream." "If it is a dream, we are both having it," Caleb replied, tightening his arm around her shoulders. They were sitting by the fire, Theresa leaning against his chest, his hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. "Do you think we will be good parents?" Theresa asked softly. "I think we will do our best, and that is all anyone can do. Children do not need perfection. They need love and stability, and someone who will always be there for them." As if in response, the baby kicked hard against Caleb's palm. He laughed in delight. "Did you feel that?" "I feel every kick," Theresa said ruefully. "This one is active, especially at night. Strong, like his mother." "Or her mother," Theresa corrected with a smile. "Or her mother," Caleb agreed. They reached the cabin 3 days later, arriving just as the first real snowstorm of the season began to blow in from the north. Caleb quickly got Theresa inside and then spent a frantic hour securing the animals, bringing in extra firewood, and making sure everything was battened down. By nightfall, the storm was raging, wind howling around the cabin and snow falling so thick they could barely see 10 feet. But inside, the cabin was warm and secure. Caleb and Theresa sat by the fire, hands clasped, watching the storm through the small window. "I am glad we are home," Theresa said. "Home." The word filled Caleb with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. This was home now, not just his refuge from the world, but a real home, with a wife he loved and a child on the way. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Caleb's life. He and Theresa fell into an easy rhythm, working together to prepare for the baby's arrival. Caleb built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving simple designs into the headboard. Theresa sewed baby clothes and blankets, knitted tiny socks and caps. They talked about names. For a boy, they agreed on Thomas after Caleb's father. For a girl, they debated between several options before settling on Clara. As Theresa grew larger and more uncomfortable, Caleb took over more of the household tasks. He cooked their meals, did the washing, helped her in and out of bed when her back hurt too much to move easily. He never complained, never made her feel like a burden. "You are amazing," Theresa told him one night as he rubbed her aching feet. "I do not know what I did to deserve you." "You did not have to do anything," Caleb said. "You just had to be you." Christmas came with 3 feet of snow on the ground and more falling. Caleb had managed to shoot a small deer a week earlier, and they roasted venison for their Christmas dinner. They had no fancy decorations, but Caleb had cut a small pine tree, and Theresa had made ornaments from scraps of fabric and bits of yarn. "I have a gift for you," Caleb said after dinner. He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a book, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman. Theresa gasped with delight. Books were precious things, especially this far from any town. "How did you get this?" she asked. "I ordered it from Prescott before we left. Mrs. Patterson promised to hold it for me, and I picked it up while you were at the seamstress. I remembered you said you loved poetry." "Oh, Caleb," Theresa threw her arms around him as best she could with her belly in the way. "This is perfect. Thank you." "I have something for you too," Theresa said shyly. She handed him a package, smaller than his. Inside was a pair of leather gloves, beautifully made with careful stitching and lined with soft rabbit fur. "You made these?" Caleb asked in amazement. "I have been working on them for weeks in secret. Your old gloves are falling apart, and I wanted you to have something warm for when you go out in the cold." Caleb pulled her close and kissed her deeply. "They are perfect. You are perfect." The baby came 3 weeks later, on a frigid January night when the wind rattled the shutters and fresh snow fell in a steady whisper. Theresa's labor began in the late afternoon, starting with mild cramps that gradually intensified. Caleb had spent weeks reading the medical book he had purchased in Prescott, preparing himself as best he could. But when the moment actually arrived, he felt a surge of panic. What if something went wrong? What if he could not help her? What if he lost her? "Caleb," Theresa gasped, gripping his hand, "I need you to be calm. Can you do that for me?" He took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, I can do that. Tell me what you need." The labor lasted through the night and into the early hours of dawn. Caleb stayed by Theresa's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping sweat from her forehead, supporting her as she walked around the cabin trying to ease the pain. He had never felt so helpless in his life, watching her suffer and knowing there was nothing he could do to take away her pain. But Theresa was strong. She endured each contraction with gritted teeth and fierce determination, never crying out, never complaining. When the time finally came to push, she bore down with everything she had. "I can see the head," Caleb said, his voice shaking. "Theresa, you are doing it, just a little more." With a final push, the baby slid into Caleb's waiting hands. For a moment, there was silence. Then the baby let out a loud, indignant wail that filled the cabin. "It is a boy," Caleb said, his voice choked with emotion. "Theresa, we have a son." He quickly cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft flannel blanket, then placed him in Theresa's arms. She looked down at the tiny face, the button nose, the shock of dark hair, and began to cry. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered. "Hello, my beautiful boy." Caleb knelt beside the bed, one arm around Theresa, one hand gently touching the baby's tiny fist. Thomas's eyes, dark and unfocused, seemed to look right at him. In that moment, Caleb felt a love so fierce it nearly stopped his breath. This was his son. Not by blood, perhaps, but by every choice that mattered. "He is perfect," Caleb said. "You are perfect, both of you." The weeks that followed were exhausting but wonderful. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong. though he woke frequently to nurse. Caleb took over all the household tasks, letting Theresa rest and recover from the birth. He changed diapers, walked the floor with Thomas when he fussed, brought Theresa meals in bed. "You're going to spoil me," Theresa protested one morning when Caleb brought her breakfast on a tray. "Good," Caleb replied. "You deserve to be spoiled." As winter slowly gave way to early spring, their little family settled into routines. Thomas grew bigger and more alert, his eyes following movement, his tiny hands grasping at anything within reach. Theresa recovered her strength, and gradually they returned to sharing the household work. One evening in late March, as they sat by the fire with Thomas sleeping in his cradle, Theresa brought up a subject that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Caleb, I need to tell you something." He looked up from the piece of leather he had been working into a new belt. "What is it?" "I've been thinking about my father, about Ash Fork. I know I said I never wanted to see him again, but now that Thomas is here, I find myself wondering if I should try to reach out. He is Thomas's grandfather, after all." Caleb set aside his work and considered his words carefully. "What do you hope will happen if you reach out?" "I do not know. Maybe nothing. Maybe he will reject me all over again. But I think I need to try. I do not want to live the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had extended an olive branch." "Then we will go to Ash Fork," Caleb said, "together. I will not let you face him alone." "You would do that, even after how he treated me? He is your father and Thomas's grandfather. If there is a chance for reconciliation, it is worth taking. But Theresa, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that he may not have softened. Some people are too proud to admit when they are wrong." "I know, but I have to try." They made plans to travel to Ash Fork in late April, once the spring mud had dried enough to make the roads passable. Caleb was nervous about taking Thomas on such a journey when he was still so small, but Theresa was determined, and he would not let her go alone. They arrived in Ash Fork on a warm afternoon when the desert was blooming with wildflowers. The town looked much as Caleb remembered from his occasional supply runs, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street with the Verde River winding through the valley beyond. Theresa directed him to her father's general store, a substantial building on the main thoroughfare. As they approached, Caleb saw her hands trembling where they held Thomas against her chest. "Are you certain you want to do this?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I am certain." They tied the horses and entered the store. A bell chimed above the door, announcing their arrival. The interior was dim after the bright sunshine outside, filled with the familiar smells of coffee and leather and tobacco. Behind the counter stood a man in his 50s, tall and spare, with iron-gray hair and a stern expression. Theresa's father. He looked up at the sound of the bell, and his eyes went wide with shock when he saw his daughter. For a moment, no one moved. Then his gaze dropped to the baby in Theresa's arms, and his expression hardened. "So," he said coldly, "you have come back to flaunt your shame." "No, father," Theresa said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I came back to introduce you to your grandson and to tell you that I'm married now." Her father's gaze shifted to Caleb, taking in his size, his rough clothing, the obvious strength in his frame. "Married to whom? What man would take damaged goods?" Caleb felt anger surge through him, but he kept his voice level. "I am Caleb Hawthorne, sir, and I would ask that you not speak about my wife that way." "Your wife?" the older man repeated with a bitter laugh. "Did she tell you the truth about herself, about what she did?" "She told me everything," Caleb said firmly, "and none of it changed how I feel about her. Theresa is brave and strong and loving. She is an excellent mother and a wonderful wife. You threw away something precious when you cast her out." "I did what any father would do to protect his family's reputation." "No? Oh," Caleb said. "You did what a coward does when faced with a difficult situation. You chose reputation over love, appearance over truth." Theresa's father's face flushed with anger. "How dare you come into my store and speak to me that way?" "How dare you speak about my wife and son that way?" Caleb moved to stand slightly in front of Theresa, his body language protective but not aggressive. "We came here hoping for reconciliation, hoping you might want to be part of your grandson's life. But if you cannot treat Theresa with respect, we will leave and not return." For a long moment, the older man said nothing. His eyes kept returning to Thomas, who had woken and was looking around with wide, curious eyes. Something flickered across his face, some emotion quickly suppressed. "What is the child's name?" he asked finally, his voice rough. "Thomas," Theresa said softly. "Thomas Hawthorne, after Caleb's father." "He looks like you did as a baby," her father said. "Same dark hair, same eyes." "He is a good baby," Theresa said. "Strong and healthy. You would be proud of him if you gave yourself the chance." Her father's jaw worked, and for a moment Caleb thought he might soften. But then he shook his head. "I cannot. People in this town, they know what happened. If I welcome you back, if I acknowledge the child, it will be seen as condoning what you did." "What I did?" Theresa's voice rose with anger. "What I did was fall in love with a man who lied to me. What I did was tell the truth when it would have been easier to lie. What I did was survive when you threw me out with nothing. I am not ashamed of any of that." "You should be." "No, Father, you should be ashamed. You should be ashamed that you cared more about what the neighbors thought than about your own daughter. You should be ashamed that you are missing the chance to know your grandson because of pride." Theresa turned to Caleb. "We should go. This was a mistake." But before they could leave, the back door of the store opened and a woman entered. She was perhaps 40, with graying brown hair and kind eyes that widened when she saw Theresa. "Theresa, is that really you?" "Mrs. Wilson," Theresa said with surprise. Mrs. Wilson had been her mother's closest friend and had helped in the store after her mother died. "Oh, my dear girl." Mrs. Wilson hurried forward and embraced Theresa carefully, mindful of the baby. "I have been so worried about you. When your father said you had left, I feared the worst." "I am well," Theresa said. "I am married now to Caleb, and this is our son Thomas." Mrs. Wilson looked at Caleb with approval, then gently touched Thomas's cheek. "He is beautiful. Congratulations to you both." She turned to Theresa's father, her expression stern. "Joseph, you stubborn fool. Your daughter has come home with your grandson, and you are standing there like a stone. Have you learned nothing?" "Stay out of this, Margaret," he said gruffly. "I will not. Sarah would be ashamed of you right now. Your wife loved Theresa more than anything in this world, and you threw her out over something that was not even her fault. She should have been more careful." "She was 19 years old and in love," Mrs. Wilson snapped. "She trusted the wrong person. That does not make her a bad person, it makes her human. And now she has made a good life for herself despite you, and you are too proud to admit you were wrong." Caleb watched the older man's face, seeing the internal struggle there. Finally, Joseph looked at Theresa, really looked at her, and some of the hardness in his expression cracked. "You look well," he said quietly. "I am well. Caleb takes good care of us." "And you are truly married? It is legal?" "We were married in Flagstaff by Reverend Morrison. It is recorded in the church books." Joseph nodded slowly. "That is good. I'm glad you found someone." It was not an apology, not quite, but it was something. Aloud, Theresa seemed to recognize that this was as much as her father could give right now. "If you would like to visit sometime," she said carefully, "we have a cabin in the high country above here. You would be welcome." "Maybe," Joseph said, "maybe I will come when I can get away from the store." They all knew he was trying to save face, but Theresa did not push. She simply nodded. "The offer stands. Always." Mrs. Wilson insisted they stay for lunch, and over sandwiches and coffee she caught Theresa up on all the town gossip. She pointedly did not mention the scandal that had driven Theresa away, instead focusing on mundane things: who had married, who had moved away, what new businesses had opened. Joseph remained mostly silent, but Caleb noticed his eyes kept returning to Thomas. When the baby fussed and Theresa excused herself to a back room to nurse him, Joseph spoke quietly. "You truly care for her?" "I love her," Caleb said simply, "more than I can express in words." "And the boy, you will raise him as your own." "He is my own. Not by blood, but by choice, which matters more. I will love him and protect him and teach him to be a good man. You have my word on that." Joseph studied him for a long moment. "She could have done worse," he said finally, which Caleb took as grudging approval. When Theresa returned with Thomas, they prepared to leave. Mrs. Wilson hugged them both warmly and made Theresa promise to visit again soon. Joseph walked them to the door. "Theresa," he said as they were about to leave. She turned back. "Yes, Father." "I'm glad you are safe. I'm glad you found someone good." It was not everything Theresa had hoped for, but tears filled her eyes anyway. Thank you. They rode out of Ash Fork in the late afternoon, Thomas strapped securely to Theresa's chest in a cloth carrier Caleb had fashioned. Once they were out of sight of the town, Theresa began to cry in earnest. Caleb immediately reined in his horse. "What is wrong? Did he hurt you?" "No," Theresa said through her tears. "I am crying because I am happy. He did not welcome me back with open arms, but he did not drive me away either. And he acknowledged you as my husband, acknowledged Thomas. It is more than I expected. Do you think he will visit?" "Maybe. Eventually. He needs time to get past his pride." Theresa wiped her eyes. "But even if he does not, it is all right. We have each other, and we have Thomas. That is enough." They returned to the cabin and fell back into their peaceful routine. Spring bloomed into summer, and Thomas grew rapidly, his dark eyes bright and curious, his smile quick and easy. Caleb taught Theresa to shoot, thinking it important that she be able to defend herself and Thomas if he was ever away from the cabin. In August, when Thomas was 7 months old, Joseph finally came to visit. He rode up to the cabin on a Saturday afternoon, looking uncomfortable but determined. Theresa invited him in, and Caleb shook his hand with careful courtesy. The visit was awkward at first, with long silences and stilted conversation. But then Thomas, who had been napping, woke and began to fuss. Joseph watched as Theresa picked up the baby, watched as Caleb moved close to them with easy affection, his large hand gentle on Thomas's head. "He is growing well," Joseph observed. "Would you like to hold him?" Theresa asked. Joseph hesitated, then nodded. Theresa placed Thomas in his arms, and the baby looked up at his grandfather with solemn interest. Joseph's stern expression softened. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly. "I am your grandfather." Something in Caleb's chest loosened at the sight. This was not a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning. Joseph stayed for dinner, and over venison stew and fresh bread, he and Caleb found common ground, discussing hunting, trading, and the best routes through the mountains. When Joseph left, he promised to come again the next month. "Thank you," Theresa said to Caleb that night as they prepared for bed, "for being patient with him, for welcoming him here even after how he treated me." "He is your father," Caleb said, "and Thomas's grandfather. Families are complicated, but they are worth fighting for when they are worth having." As the years passed, Joseph's visits became more frequent. Gradually, the relationship between father and daughter healed, though it would never be quite what it had been before. But Joseph proved to be a doting grandfather, and Thomas loved the stories he told about Theresa's childhood and about his own youth. When Thomas was 2, Theresa told Caleb she was pregnant again. This time, there was no fear or shame, only joy. Their daughter was born on a crisp October morning, her arrival much easier than Thomas's had been. They named her Clara, and she had Caleb's brown eyes and Theresa's dark hair. Joseph arrived the day after Clara's birth with gifts for both children, a carved wooden horse for Thomas, and a soft blanket for the baby. He held his granddaughter with gentle hands and admitted to Theresa that he had been a fool to ever cast her out. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of judgment, afraid of what people would think, but I should have been more afraid of losing you. I'm sorry, Theresa. Truly sorry." "I forgive you," Theresa said simply. "We cannot change the past, but we can build a better future." Caleb watched this exchange and felt profound gratitude. Their family, which had started in such pain and difficulty, had become something beautiful. He had 2 healthy children, a wife he adored, and even a relationship, however complicated, with his father-in-law. When Clara was 6 months old, Caleb began building an addition onto the cabin. Their little home was feeling cramped with 2 children, and he wanted to give them more space. Joseph came up to help with the construction, and the 2 men worked side by side, building walls and raising roof beams. "You have been good for her," Joseph said one afternoon as they took a break from work. "Better than I could have hoped when I first met you. Thank you for taking care of my daughter." "I do not take care of her," Caleb said. "We take care of each other. That is what marriage should be." Joseph nodded thoughtfully. "You are right. I think I never understood that, not even with Sarah. I always thought a husband should provide and a wife should obey. But what you and Theresa have, it is different. Better." Over the next few years, their family continued to grow and thrive. Thomas proved to be bright and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. Caleb taught him to track animals, to identify plants, to read the weather in the clouds. Clara was quieter, but equally intelligent, with a gift for music that surprised them all. Caleb bought her a small dulcimer from a traveling merchant, and she taught herself to play by ear. When Thomas was 7 and Clara was 5, Theresa became pregnant for the 3rd time. This baby, another boy, they named Jacob. He was born during a spring thunderstorm, arriving quickly and easily, as if eager to join their noisy, happy family. Life in the mountains was not always easy. There were harsh winters and dry summers, years when game was scarce and money was tight. But through it all, Caleb and Theresa stood together, their love deepening with each challenge they overcame. One evening, when Thomas was 12, Clara was 10, and Jacob was 5, the family gathered around the fireplace as a late spring snow fell outside. Caleb was teaching Jacob to whittle, while Theresa helped Clara with her reading. Thomas was absorbed in a book about explorers and faraway places. Looking around at his family, at these people he loved more than life itself, Caleb felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. He thought back to that day 10 years ago when he had found Theresa by the creek, broken and afraid. He thought about the choices they had both made, the courage it had taken to build this life together. "What are you thinking about?" Theresa asked softly, noticing his expression. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Caleb said, "about how one day changed everything." "The day you found me. The day we found each other," Caleb corrected. That summer, Joseph passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 73 years old and had, in his final years, become a fixture at the mountain cabin, spending summers with his daughter's family and teaching his grandchildren everything he knew about business and trading. His funeral was held in Ash Fork, and Theresa spoke at the service about forgiveness and second chances. "My father was not a perfect man," she said to the gathered mourners, "but he loved his family, and in the end, he found the courage to admit when he was wrong. That is all any of us can hope to do." After the funeral, several people approached Theresa to apologize for how they had treated her years ago. She accepted their apologies with grace, though Caleb could see it still hurt. Some wounds never fully healed. They just became scars you learned to live with. As the children grew older, they began to forge their own paths. Thomas, at 16, announced his intention to become a teacher, inspired by the books Caleb had encouraged him to read. Clara wanted to study music in San Francisco, though she was only 14, and such plans were still far in the future. Jacob, at 9, was still trying to figure out who he wanted to be, but he had his father's love of the mountains and his mother's determination. One evening, as Caleb and Theresa sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, she leaned against his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Taking me in that day, marrying me, raising Thomas as your own?" Caleb turned to look at her, at the woman who had given his life meaning and purpose. Her dark hair was touched with silver now, and fine lines creased the corners of her eyes, but she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Not for one single moment," he said firmly. "You and the children are the best things that ever happened to me. I would make the same choices again 1,000 times over. Even though it has not always been easy? Especially because it has not always been easy. The things worth having are worth working for. You taught me that." Theresa smiled and kissed him softly. "I love you, Caleb Hawthorne. I love you too, Theresa Hawthorne. Always." As the years continued to pass, Caleb and Theresa watched their children grow into remarkable adults. Thomas did become a teacher, taking a position in Flagstaff where he taught reading and arithmetic to children of miners and ranchers. He married a fellow teacher, an intelligent young woman named Ruth, and they had 3 children of their own. Clara's talent for music took her first to San Francisco, as she had dreamed, and then to Denver, where she performed in concert halls and taught private lessons. She never married, choosing instead to focus on her career, and she sent letters home filled with stories of the places she saw and the people she met. Jacob stayed closest to home, eventually building his own cabin just a few miles from Caleb and Theresa's. He became a skilled craftsman, making furniture and tools that were sought after throughout the territory. He married at 22, a rancher's daughter named Emily, and they raised 4 children in the mountain valley that had sheltered Caleb and Theresa for so long. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Caleb surprised Theresa with a trip to the ocean, the dream she had mentioned so long ago. They took the train to San Diego and spent a week walking on the beach, watching the waves roll in, marveling at the endless expanse of blue. "It is even more beautiful than I imagined," Theresa said, standing with her bare feet in the surf, her skirts hitched up to keep them dry. Caleb wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You are more beautiful than I could have imagined," he murmured. "Then or now." As they grew older, Caleb and Theresa remained devoted to each other. When Caleb's joints began to ache from decades of hard mountain living, Theresa would rub liniment into his shoulders and knees with patient hands. When Theresa's eyes grew weaker, making reading difficult, Caleb would read aloud to her every evening, his deep voice bringing stories to life. They were blessed with grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, each one treasured and loved. The cabin that had once been Caleb's lonely refuge became the heart of a sprawling family, a place where multiple generations gathered for holidays and celebrations. Thomas never forgot that Caleb was not his biological father, but it never mattered. "You are my father in every way that counts," he told Caleb on his 40th birthday. "You chose to love me when you did not have to. That means more than any accident of birth." On a warm summer evening, when Caleb was 72 and Theresa was 68, they sat together on the porch they had rebuilt and expanded over the years. Their children and grandchildren were visiting, and the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from inside the house. "Do you remember the day we met?" Theresa asked, taking Caleb's gnarled hand in hers. "Every detail," Caleb replied. "You were sitting by the creek, looking like you had lost everything. But you were so brave, even then. I was terrified. If you had not found me, I do not know what would have happened. But I did find you. Or maybe you found me. Maybe we found each other." Theresa rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink toward the mountains that had been their home for more than 40 years. "It has been a good life," Theresa said softly. "The best," Caleb agreed. "I would not change a single moment." Inside, their great-grandson began to cry, and they heard their granddaughter soothing him with the same lullaby Theresa had once sung to Thomas. The sound carried on the evening breeze, a reminder that their love story had created ripples that would extend far beyond their own lives. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Caleb and Theresa remained on the porch, hands clasped, hearts full. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, a disgraced pregnant woman and a lonely mountain man. But together, they had built something extraordinary, a family bound not by blood alone, but by choice and love and unwavering commitment. The mountain man who had walked his bride down the aisle, who had stood beside her with pride when her own father had rejected her, had kept every promise he made that day in the little church in Flagstaff. He had honored her, protected her, stood beside her through everything life threw at them, and the brave young woman who had refused to lie, who had chosen truth over comfort and love over reputation, had proven herself more than worthy of his devotion. Together, they had created a legacy that would endure for generations, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of commitment, and the transformative nature of love freely given. As the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across the valley below, Caleb pulled Theresa closer and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For trusting me that day by the creek, for choosing to marry me, for every moment since." Theresa smiled, her face soft in the moonlight. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked away. Thank you for loving not just me, but my son as your own. Thank you for building this beautiful life with me." They sat together long after everyone else had gone to bed, two souls who had found each other when they needed it most, who had chosen love over fear, hope over despair. Their story, which had begun in pain and rejection, had become a tale of redemption, of family forged through choice rather than circumstance, of love that had only deepened and strengthened with time. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.